Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I'd like to introduce you to Gimp, or the Image Manipulation Program. If you've never used Gimp or heard of it before, the easiest comparison would be to Photoshop. Photoshop, if you haven't heard of it, is essentially the premier image editing program that's out there. However, Photoshop happens to be a paid program offered by Adobe. Very quality, but it's a paid program. Of course, that's the main difference between Gimp and Photoshop, I would say. Photoshop might have a little bit more features, might be a little bit more robust, but I would say Gimp is actually a close second when it comes to manipulating images, creating computer-generated art that involves pencil and brush strokes, and that kind of thing, setting up guides, and many other tools that allow you to create pretty decent artwork, honestly. And another nice thing about Gimp is that it's available on all of the major computer platforms, including Mac, Windows, and Linux, whereas Photoshop, while you have it on Mac, I believe you cannot get it on Linux currently. So whenever you boot up Gimp, you're going to see something pretty similar to this. You have your main window here with all of your menu options, the canvas for the image you're working on in the middle. You may not actually see this gray space out here, depending on how far you zoomed in. It might look a little bit more like this, just plain white. And just real quick, if you want to zoom in and out, I would recommend using the middle mouse wheel and holding down Control to scroll in and out. So that'll really help you while you're trying to look at the whole picture within Gimp, or just a small element within Gimp when you really need to zoom in. So moving on, just like any other program, if you want to start working on your file, you just go up to the File menu, start a new image. You can also open up just about any kind of image format that are out there. BMP, PNG, JPEG, GIF files. Pretty much anything that's common should be able to be opened up within Gimp. And Gimp also has its own document format that you would actually, when you hit the Save button in Gimp, it's not actually going to save as an image, it's going to save as this document type, which is a .xcf file. And why you would ever want to do this is so that you can actually go back into the image and make changes to it with all the information still stored inside the document, everything that you did. Basically, the main thing is really the layers. You would lose the layers, for instance, if you actually exported to an image like a PNG. So by saving it in a document format, the .xcf, you can go back in and manipulate the layers later on. Hopefully that makes sense, but it should in a second here after we talk a little bit more about layers. So these layers are basically groupings of changes that you've committed to your document. And you can have those changes be applied on these different layers. So I can create multiple layers, and then whenever I start drawing on the document, let's say I select the brush over here from the toolbox, and I just draw that. Well, that change has been made on the layer 1, number 1 layer. So if I do anything to manipulate that entire layer, or I delete the layer, that's only going to apply to the changes that I ever did within that specific layer. And that can become really important when you're working in more complicated image documents. So let's say I also had this other layer over here. I went back over to the toolbox, paintbrush is selected, and I can go down here for more tools. For instance, if I want to select a new type of brush, and I draw this line through it. Well, in a typical image manipulation program, like let's say Microsoft Paint, very, very basic, you wouldn't have these layers to work with. So if you wanted to make a change, like let's say to erase part of what's going on, but you only wanted to erase this new line, you didn't want to erase the old line where it's kind of chalky, you would basically have to really be careful about your erasing. But here, because they're on different layers, the changes I apply only apply to the layer that's selected. So layer 1 selected, that's where I made the black line. If I hold down the left mouse button and I scroll through it, you can see it makes changes. It erases the black line because that's on the current layer, but it doesn't change anything on the other layers in the background, namely the white background layer and the layer number 1. So another thing we could do, delete an entire layer all at once. So layer 1, number 1, it's gone completely, but everything else is still there remaining. So hopefully you can see how these layers are really useful. If you want to get good at image editing, layers will really help you out a lot. So I kind of glossed over the toolbox and the layers dialog box over here. But in addition to the main window of Gimp, you of course have these different dialog boxes which give you a whole lot more functionality, basically as buttons, drop-down menus, options that are available to you, and it can help you while you're working within your image documents. There are more than just the toolbox and layers brushes here, but these are probably the two most useful ones. The toolbox, of course, it contains all of your basic tools, the ability to do gradients, the ability to basically hit the bucket and what do they even call it? The bucket fill tool, and to make the entire background one thing, like a pattern fill, by clicking on that radio button and then clicking back on the document, and then bam, suddenly background. Nothing too special, but these are your standard image program tools, and there's a few extras on this one. For instance, let's see, what wouldn't be in a classic program? Perhaps the smudge, dodge, and burn tools. So to demonstrate this really quick, I'm going to zoom in once again by hitting Control and scrolling up on my mouse wheel, and I'm going to use the, I believe it's burn when it's left click, or it could be dodge. But these are tools that can kind of, I mean, obviously this isn't how you would really use it, but to kind of lighten or darken certain parts of your image. You want to be more subtle about it if you're going to do this. Let's say you're touching up somebody's face in Photoshop, or, well, trying to do the same thing within Gimp. But these are tools that you maybe wouldn't get inside of just Microsoft Paint. Just for instance, not really going to go into them in too much detail here because of time, obviously. So if you ever lose one of your toolboxes because you closed it out on accident, just go up to Windows, and if you just recently closed that window, you can use recently closed dialog boxes to open that back up in the same position. And of course, if you want to get a new dialog box for some extra functionality, just go to Dockable Dialogs and you can find all of the ones that are available to you right there. So to talk a little bit more about layers and images, specifically with these two menus up here. When you're talking about the layer, once again, that's the set of changes that you made while you were working within that one designation, and the designation is the layer. So you create a new layer, and as long as you have that layer selected, all the changes are basically going to be grouped together. But the image is referring to everything all together at once. So whenever you go up to the image menu, and let's say you scale it, that's going to be scaling everything within this document. So I'll demonstrate that here. Let's bump it up a few hundred pixels, and I'll keep this link right there solid, which basically means that whenever I change the height, the width, it's going to change the height, and vice versa, to keep the same ratio. So I scaled it up a couple hundred pixels wider, and a bit under 100 pixels less, a bit under 100 pixels higher as well, and that applied to everything all at once. However, if I was to, say, make some changes within this new layer, so the only thing in this layer now is going to be this black box I've drawn, and then I go up to the layer menu and I do a scale for the layer, and let's go ahead and make that, let's say 2000, so that it's very visible. It's only going to be scaling the components, the changes that I've actually made within that layer itself. So that's basically what you need to know about those two things. A lot of the same functionality can be found in each of these two different menus. And just knowing the image will affect everything all at once should get you going where you need to be. So one more thing I want to talk about here is the guides. Guides also exist within Photoshop, and they're quite useful because when you're working in an image, if you're just kind of freehanding everything, it's not going to be pixel perfect. Like, you can kind of go over to this point here and be like, okay, well, I want it to be at the 250 pixel mark, and then basically draw down from that. And even if you have a perfect line, it's not necessarily going to be on the dot at, say, 250 pixels. By the way, if you do want to create a perfectly straight line with the brush tool, I would suggest left-clicking where you want the start point to be, and then hitting Shift and Control. The Shift makes it a line that's straight, and the Control will make the angle basically round up to the nearest section. So I believe it goes in 30 degrees here. Looks about 30 degrees. So if I basically move the mouse cursor straight down, it's going to be a perfectly straight line. And if I zoom in a bit, looks to be good. But if you want that line to be on the dot, then you need to be using guides. So how you would create a guide is, if you want a horizontal guide, you left click over here on the ruler to the left, drag this guide to where you want it, and it'll tell you at what pixel this guide is actually stopping at. So we can go up to 250, let go, and now we have a guide which is marking the exact point where 250 pixels horizontally from the start of the images. We can also create vertical guides from dragging them down from the top, left click, and drag them to where you want them to be. Let's say 250 pixels again. And as long as we have snapping enabled, we can use this to make sure that we get our lines or different components of the image placed at where we want them precisely. So to make sure that snapping is enabled, you can go to View and scroll down a bit. You'll see Snap to Guide, Snap to Grid, Snap to Canvas Edges, which of course is where the gray background starts and our actual image begins, and Snap to Active Path. In this case, we're just worrying about snapping to the guides. Now, if you want to start drawing precisely along these guidelines, all you need to do, because snapping is enabled, is basically go hover over them, start left-clicking with the brush or whatever tool you happen to be working with, and start dragging across. You might not actually get it perfect there initially, so you got to be kind of careful not to jitter it too much, because the snapping will stop working if you have the mouse cursor stray too far from the actual line. Okay, I'm gonna let go of the left mouse button just in case I make another mistake, and touch up this side on the left, and that's another way you can get a perfectly straight line there. But it's not just for lines. You can also have snapping work with, say, text. So we start typing in some text, let's say text, and then we want the left bound basically range of this text box to be at the snapping line. So we just drag that over to the line, and you see as we get closer, it's just going to snap to it. So the text now, because I snapped the top left corner of this text box to this to the 250 pixel line there, the text is now going to start at 250 pixels horizontally over from the start of our image. Alternatively, it's also possible to simply enable a grid by going to View, Show Grid, and if you have Snap to Grid enabled, then you can snap to these different components of the grid just as easily. Now let's say, however, that when you're snapping to the grid, you don't want this many little tiny boxes. You can actually modify the grid so that there are less of them by going up to Image and Configure Grid. So we can space them apart much more than 10 pixels. That's just the default. So let's say 100 pixels for height and width. Hit OK. And maybe with this background it's not the most perfect example, so I'll go ahead and delete that background out. But you can see that now there is this grid we can snap to, kind of like as if we had these different guidelines. But basically for every 100 pixels up or 100 pixels down inside our document. So this can help us out pretty much in the same way as the guides, but having them set up for the whole document all at once. The advantage of guides, of course, is that you can place the guides down at any point in time you want. Before we save and export, there is one more thing I want to show you guys for today, and that is filters. So filters can basically be thought of as special effects you can apply to your document or to a single layer within your document. In this case, I'm going to use the filters to add a border in, and we'll also do drop shadow. Those are the two most common ones I like to use. So under decor, we can go down to the add border, which will bring up a dialog box. Of course, it happened in the background there. And we can really easily create a new border by specifying a size for the vertical border and the horizontal border, as well as giving it a color. And you'll see how this effect can really turn out and be kind of nice, actually. So you can see that the border effect within the filters for Gimp isn't a standard border. I forget what they actually call this effect, bevel or something like that. But it's actually quite nice, and you'll notice I use this effect in a lot of my YouTube thumbnails. So that's a really cool filter there. Another one that we can use with text, the drop shadow, as I previously mentioned, is really nice when you want the text to stand out a lot more than normal. So let's say we had some red text here at 100 pixels, then we type it in. So test text. No, that's not quite right. Test text. Okay, there. And the positioning here is actually perfect because you can kind of see that this black background there, it doesn't have the best merging with the solid text into that black background. So by actually adding drop shadow, it should make the text itself stand out a little more. So with the text layer selected, we can go up to Filters, Light and Shadow, Drop Shadow. If we wanted to, we could specify some different options to make it look a little bit different. I'm going to make the opacity pretty high, just so that we can kind of see what we're working with. Hit OK, and you can see with this very default drop shadow that it makes the text pop out a little more. And it's basically easier to see. Easier to see for thumbnails, easier to see basically any place you're going to add text. So that's drop shadow, that's border, and there are a whole lot more filters that you can apply to your images, to your artwork. You just have to basically go into the filters menu and find out what options are available to you. So finally, when you're done with your image inside of Gimp, or at least you want to save your progress and come back to it later. So when you're done working within Gimp and you want to go ahead and export your image as a PNG, as a JPEG, or whatever kind of image format you want, go up to the File menu and choose Export or Export As. Export will use whatever settings you had previously, if any, and Export As will allow you to basically specify the output type. However, that's how you would get the image itself if you want to simply save the document, the Gimp file itself, so that you can come back in and edit it and manipulate the layers in the future, which is a really good idea if you think you might ever need to again. Go to File and Save or Save As instead, and then you can just specify where you want to save it on your computer, and you should essentially be good to go. So obviously that's not everything there is to working within Gimp, but I hope that this introductory tutorial has brought you up to speed a little bit and that you at least have learned a couple of things that you can use to apply to your own images and artwork while you're working within Gimp. It's a really cool tool and you honestly can't beat the price of free. So I've been Chris, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.